Welcome
Welcome
to Modern Mind
to Modern Mind
Ancient Book,
Ancient Book,
where we, together, explore one of the most important books in human history. Nick, welcome to another Modern Mind Ancient Book. We're going to be dealing with the Book of Samuel today.
Glad to be here.
Good day at church today. I felt the service was good. We're almost there.
We're very close, and I think the prayer times on Friday nights are definitely moving us in that right direction.
Yeah. It's either here or our church has started a program that's focusing on prayer, and the power of God is clearly being displayed because of it. So if you're a faithful person, we advise you to pray regularly, often, without ceasing, if you can, and get into the Word, because it really does have an effect on your life.
It does.
2 Samuel and 1 Samuel are indeed one book. We have and we kept the tradition of the Septuagint as it stands as 1 and 2 Samuel. The idea is that the scroll may have been too big to be just one single scroll, and so it was broken out into two separate scrolls in order to preserve it a little more easily by those who translated it from Hebrew to Greek.
That makes sense. I mean, I wouldn't want to try to handle that
Carry
by
on
myself.
a gigantic scroll.
You could do it, but not all of us are.
Don't even want. They're kind of delicate.
True.
Yeah.
True.
So yeah, we do have a division, but this is just one book. It's the Book of Samuel. The Hebrew does call it Samuel. The English version also calls it Samuel, but the Septuagint called it the Book of Kingdoms. And they had two separate scrolls.
Right. So, do you think that was as not to be confused with Kings?
Well, obviously so. So that goes into the authorship and the purpose, because the Jewish translators who took it from Hebrew into Greek knew to whom it was written, so they called it the Book of Kingdoms, because it was written to the United Monarchy under, at that point, King David. This particular book, the content of it, goes through a few main characters. So you have Hannah and her faithfulness and prayer at the tabernacle, which brought the miraculous birth of Samuel, who was dedicated to the temple under the leadership of Eli and his sons, who were not good at their management.
Right,
of
the
God's,
sons were corrupt and Eli let them get away with it.
Yeah, nasty stuff. Yeah. Sleeping with women, taking offerings that they should not be taken at the wrong times, just kind of piggy.
Yeah.
And so Eli died a kind of crazy death, so the question was asked earlier, was Eli faithful? And not really, no, because he allowed his sons to do evil things and didn't stop them.
Right.
Even though for the period before he handed rulership or leadership of the tabernacle over, it appears he was a good leader. That's what it says. He was a faithful man. But his kids got out of control, and he didn't stop them. You got to love your kids, but not to a fault, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's not loving them to just let them do whatever they're going to do anyway.
There's a lesson for us in this world today, because we have to care about our kids and to stop them from being a part of the evil parts of the world, and ultimately it cost Eli quite a lot. He fell and broke his neck. There's a gluttonous thing there too, right? Like, he was such a big man, he couldn't stop himself from breaking his own neck when he fell.
Right. Yeah. That's got to be a detail that matters too, as we've discussed in the previous ones. It's not for nothing.
Yeah, if you think about that, the excess that was available wasn't to be indulged in that manner. So God's service to God will bring you excess, but you're not to be piggy.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Interesting. So, okay. So the title we got, it's Samuel in English. It's Samuel in Hebrew. It's the Book of Kingdoms because it was written to the United Monarchy for the people to consider, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Septuagint, or the Greek translation, made it two separate books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and it calls it the Book of Kingdoms. Authorship, Nick?
So the authorship is anonymous, but the tradition says that Samuel was the author, and at least for the greater part of what we call 1 Samuel. But because he died during the process of the time period, it was obvious that he didn't write all of it. So we have the other prophets who were responsible for recording and edited together for their records must have been responsible for the end of 1 Samuel and for 2 Samuel as well.
Yeah, so I mean, you could naturally conclude that if this was finished being compiled during the United Monarchy, that you would have the king's scribes or prophets compiling that data.
Right.
So as you suggested, in 1 Samuel 10:25, then Samuel told the people the ordinances of the kingdom and wrote them in the book and placed it before the Lord. So there you have, for sure, at least he's responsible for some of it.
Right, for that portion
But in 1 Chronicles 29 through 30, it affirms of writing ministry of various other prophets. Now the Acts of King David, which are compiled in 1st and 2nd Samuel, from first to last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer, with all his reign, his power, and circumstances which came on him, on Israel, and all the kingdoms of the lands. The latter parts of 1 Samuel and all of 2 Samuel may have been written by these various prophets and edited together from their records into 1st and 2nd Samuel, which also sheds light on why the Septuagint translators would call it the Book of Kingdoms and not Samuel or 1st and 2nd Samuel in that case, because Samuel was not the only author.
Right.
The date of 1st and 2nd Samuel, if we take it as one scroll, is 1105 BC to 971. And time runs backwards because it goes like 3500 to 0 and then 0 to 2024. Right? So if for the hearer, imagine this is actually 3,035 years ago, the beginning of this content, up to, my math isn't that good, 971, it would have been 3029, so 1,000 minus 20, so 971, and then 2024, so it was 2,990 some odd years ago at the end of it. Right? A long time ago. And yet, we're still reading these things and learning about them. And as we just discussed, excess in nasty, bad actions, like sleeping with people who are not your wives and taking advantage of women and eating too much and doing things you shouldn't be doing, still leads to death today, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And, a lot of the topics that we deal with this not only are things that we experience, but everybody loves to talk about David in Christian circles. And this is where we get much of his information. And so I think it's funny when people say, oh, I love the book of Psalms, and all the parts that David wrote. But, here we got David's, for lack of a better term, origin story. And,
that's right.
And Samuel is often overlooked, but this is an important history.
Yeah, it's very important. So this whole book, so 1st and 2nd Samuel, or the Book of Samuel, or the Book of Kingdoms, is at its core a salvation story. Because you had Eli who was fair, but his sons who were evil, and Eli who allowed it. then you have Hannah, who shows up on a Jewish high holiday, and she goes in and she prays, and Eli says, "You drank too much, lady." And she says, "No, I can't have children. I'm mourning this." And God blesses her, and she in turn dedicates Samuel.
Right.
And he becomes prophet.
The righteous one.
He prophesies of Nathan's death and of Eli's death,
yes,
and his sons. And then he assumes the ministry of the tabernacle and a judge of the people. This is Judges too.
He was the final one.
He was the final judge.
Right, okay.
So it's actually Samuel who was asked for a king.
Right.
And God allowed it. So this book is the division from prophets to kings and how it took place. And who did they get first? What did they ask for?
They asked for the king, and they got Saul.
They got a Gibborim, a tall man, a strong man, a big man.
Someone who fit what they thought they wanted in a leader based on his characteristics.
But they actually asked for like a Nephilim, right?
Yeah.
The kings of the nations around them, the men of old,
of
the hunters, the strong men, right?
Right.
And they got Saul. And, Samuel heard from God, so he said, "If you want this, it's going to cost you tremendously." And God said, "Don't worry about it. They didn't reject you. They rejected me." And they got Saul. And Saul did everything to a T that he said they would do. But then David comes into the picture. And David was a small man, not a large man.
Right.
He was not a Gibborim.
Right.
A Nephilim.
Yeah.
He was just a shepherd from Judah, or from Israel, right?
Right.
And so, it's the flips in the stories, right? The plot twists and stuff. And, it's perfect. They're so entertaining.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely.
This is an entertaining story.
Yes.
Yeah. And so David, he goes, and what does he do? He destroys a Gibborim, or a Nephilim, in Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how he gets power. So the people wanted the tall, strong man, and God gave it to him, and he was bad. And then David destroys the strong, tall man in both senses.
Right.
Although he would not destroy Saul.
Right. He didn't touch God's anointed.
Yeah.
Right. As much as he was incentivized to do it.
Plot twists and turns.
Yep.
It's the Gibborim and it's the Nephilim, but we can't destroy that one.
Right, and it was in reviewing for this that I saw that David at least had two opportunities. I remember the one where he cut the hem of the cloak
when he was relieving himself.
Right. Well, yes, and he had the chance, but it said there was twice, and it's I don't know, as I mentioned earlier, if I would have had that self-control, and even if I did have enough to respect who God put into place before me, if he had tried to kill me, as Saul did when he's throwing the spears at David, I don't know that I would have respected him to the point of mourning when he died, but David did.
Yeah. David loved his country, and he loved his God, and he loved what God did, even when it was very difficult for him.
Right.
And this story is also the story of Absalom, his son.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, listener, you should go read.
Yeah, another twists and turns and packed with emotion, and if you process this as if you know that these are real people who lived this out, it hits you. It
really hits.
Yeah.
And Bathsheba, among other things. So you get these stories, and they're super interesting, and they're worth taking the time to read, which eventually on this podcast we will go through, the jot and tittle of these stories.
Right.
At this point, we're focused on date, recipients, and authorship, and those sort of things. But it's quite interesting to note the plot twists in that thing just in themselves. So, David failed.
Oh right? Yeah, multiple times.
So you have this redemption and failure story at this point in two different instances. You have the prophet priest king idea in Eli, who's not good because of sons. Then you get Samuel, who was very strong, very good leader, dedicated by a miraculous result for Hannah, having children. Then not just Samuel, she had more children. Then you get Saul, who was the king under the prophets, the end of the judge period, and he's bad.
Right.
Very arrogant. At one point, I think he says, "Your God," on numerous occasions.
Yeah. And
when he offers sacrifices and things.
And how telling is that? Not even recognizing that, though it was a mistake, it was your God who installed him.
Yeah.
But no, thank you.
Yeah,
no
to
gratitude.
Samuel of all people.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then you get David who redeems, but then David falls numerous times, but still called a man after God's own heart.
And isn't that hopeful for all of us?
Okay, so recipients, and this goes back to the Book of the Kingdoms. So, since there was a tradition of the prophets to keep writing records of God's dealing with Israel, it could be assumed that 1st and 2nd, or just the Book of Samuel, the Book of Kingdoms, would have been available to the generations of the united monarchy under both Saul and David.
Right.
The final form would have been given to the generations of the divided monarchy. Under David, there was a civil war. These generations would have experienced the ebb and flow of both spiritual blessing and national crisis. Again, the plot twists that are all through the book. Because righteous men bring order and peace, and unrighteous rulers bring death and destruction and loss and brokenness. And that today is still very true.
Absolutely. Just when we think we know what we want, we get a Saul.
The United States might be a version of that at this present moment. So, they experienced this ebb and flow, spiritual blessings and crisis. The period of Saul was one of great hope as the nation began to assert itself militarily. That's what they wanted. They wanted a leader because they would have times of peace and then times of crisis under the judges, but they didn't have one person to lead them. So they asked for a king and a tall, strong man, just like the nations.
Right.
And that's what Saul gave them. But the same period was one of great despair as Saul assaulted the priestly system and ruled with tyranny. The early period of David brought new hope as he led the nation to national peace and a place of domination over international actors. The later period of David brought despair as domestic strife weakened the nation and sent it into turmoil. The Solomonic period brought great prosperity and peace. The third king.
Right.
David's son.
Yes.
But the transition to Solomon is definitely worth reading.
Yeah. Oh, man. That's
intense.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Solomon's whole story, from start to finish, and his triumphs, and then later his mistakes, it's
huge.
It's fascinating.
He wasn't any different than Saul, really.
Right. He didn't end up
but
that
he
way.
did love God always. He never said your God.
Right. And he started out making a great decision.
Wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And was rewarded with more, so.
And you know what? I'm seeing a motif in these as well, of that serving God brings great abundance, and what happens with great abundance? But failure.
Yeah.
It's almost like we always got to be hungry, and we've always got to be thirsty, so that we can hunger and thirst for righteousness.
Right.
Because the minute you're not hungry and thirsty and you're full, you're okay with yourself. You don't need God anymore.
Right. It's the adage, I know it's not strictly biblical, but it's true that strong men bring good times create weak men bring bad times, which create strong men.
Yep.
And, I mean, that could have been in the Bible, because it was borne out in what actually happened to them.
It's wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could call that wisdom.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
So, this Solomon character was able to build the temple with great wisdom, and like his father, he was into song and writing and poetry and things, right? He contributed quite a bit to the Old Testament, Solomon did. It was a time of national celebration with this great temple, but at the same time, idolatry, immorality, apostasy, and civil war were growing at the foundation, and the kingdom was cracking.
You're not talking about the United States again, are you? Sorry.
Yeah, you're not wrong. But again, this is the thing. 3,000 years ago, we were struggling in the same ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And why is that? Could it be this thing called sin?
Couldn't imagine.
Could it be that? Could it be that we might be slightly evil? You know? Maybe we need a redeemer. Maybe we need a judge. Maybe we need a king. Maybe we need a guy who died and rose again, who's coming as our king. Something like that. So, if you want to read this book correctly, you want to imagine you're living in a time in history when the influence of the king on the kingdom is immense. Meaning, you have to imagine yourself as being an Israelite. Your ancestors have rejected the theocracy of the Lord for a monarchical king, like the other nations. God's given you a king, but his human weaknesses bring consequence on the whole nation. You've watched the nation rise and fall under the leadership of the king. Your nation is splitting apart into Judah and Israel. Powerful men contend for places of influence, and you get to suffer for it. The nation's breaking apart because of civil war. You want to learn from the failures and successes of past leadership so you can live in covenant in peace with Yahweh. You want to learn how God has providentially cared for Israel in spite of the sins of the kings and the people. So what's the argument for this one?
So the argument would be that Israel's prosperity and security are dependent on their submission and the submission of the monarchy and the people to Yahweh.
It's almost like the people of God have to submit to him and then he brings blessing.
It's almost like that.
It's almost like that.
You know, and if they do submit to Yahweh's theocracy and obey his covenant, then they prosper, they live securely in the land, and that's what we saw with David and then for a while with Solomon as well.
Well, Nick, we're running out of time. I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's been good. Awesome.
Remember to read your Bibles, guys.
Thank you for joining us. Come back soon.
Thank you for joining us for Modern Mind, Ancient Book. We hope that the time spent with us was valuable for you. It certainly was for us. Like Isabella said, please come back soon.